Dear friends, welcome to yet another installment of Strategic Power. The British Armed Forces are facing a crisis due to a lack of adequate investment and a severe recruitment crisis. Disproportionate spending on the nuclear deterrent leaves conventional resources deficient. Additionally, scandals, poor conditions, and low morale deter young people from enlisting. Is the United Kingdom compromising its defence and power projection? Discover the shocking details in this video and share your opinions in the comments. In recent weeks, a few separate incidents have shown that the UK Army is not exactly up to the standards that most of us would want it to be. The first incident occurred when HMS Prince of Wales failed to depart for a NATO exercise due to a mechanical failure. The problem is that HMS Prince of Wales should only actually participate in NATO exercises as a substitute for HMS Queen Elizabeth, which also had to cancel at the last minute due to an issue that arose with a propeller shaft coupling. To make matters worse, just a few weeks later, the UK's latest nuclear missile test failed. The Trident missile fell into the sea near the submarine that fired it. In fact, the last Trident test, which took place 8 years ago in 2016, also failed. And, well, these incidents occurred in the context of General Patrick Sanders suggesting that if NATO goes to war with Russia in the future, the UK would have to form a civilian army because the UK armed forces are simply not large enough. These situations only serve to highlight the criticism of the British military at the moment. So in this video, we're going to take a closer look at the UK's military crisis. Before we start, if you haven't already, please consider subscribing and turning on the bell to stay up to date and be notified when we release new videos. Now, there are basically two main reasons why the UK Army is in crisis: lack of investment and a recruitment crisis. Let's look at each of them. At first glance, it seems that the UK is actually not doing so badly in terms of investment. It is in the upper half of NATO members when it comes to defence spending, with the UK committing 2.07% of its gross domestic product to defence in 2023. This remains above NATO's 2% guideline. Moreover, while some other comparable European countries like France and Germany fell below that 2% guideline, the UK has not actually done so yet. The same is true when we look at the UK's equipment spending as a proportion of GDP. It is roughly in the middle of the pack among NATO allies in that regard, with the UK spending around 28.6% of its defence budget on equipment, well above NATO's 20% guideline. The point is that, superficially, everything looks healthy. However, when we really dig into the numbers, it becomes clear that the UK Army is simply not getting the funding that it needs. Part of the problem is due to the enormous emphasis that the UK places on its nuclear deterrent, so much so that other elements of the military end up falling behind. As it stands, the nuclear deterrent is expected to account for 34% of the entire equipment budget up to 2033. Now, even that is probably an underestimation, as a report from the National Audit Office, or NAO, suggested that the latest defence equipment plan was unaffordable and that the plan would actually cost around $17 billion more than was budgeted for. The main reason for this is that the costs of the new Dreadnought ballistic missile submarines and the new nuclear warhead increased by 62% since the NAO's last report. Now, we're not going to get into a discussion about the merits of a nuclear deterrent. Everyone will have their own views on that. However, it is true to say that the entire point of having it is so that it never gets used. And if the Defence Secretary is right when he says we are now in a pre-war world, and if NATO were to go to war with Russia at some point in the future, then, assuming the nuclear taboo holds, it won't be fought with nuclear weapons. Conventional forces are still needed, and well, if we exclude the costs of the nuclear deterrent, Britain actually only spends around 1.75% on defence, below NATO's recommended 2%, and below France. And even beyond that, the UK has been spending less and less on its military over time. Way back in 1956-57, the UK was spending nearly 7% of its GDP on defence. This steadily decreased over the next half-century or more to the around 2% that we're familiar with today. The big drop that we see at the end of the graph is a result of the 2010 Defence Review, which was designed to deal with a $35 billion black hole in the defence budget. Cuts had to be made, and the entire Harrier jet fleet was retired from service years before its replacements were ready. In fact, this is something that is also happening this year, with the Navy announcing that HMS Westminster and HMS Argyle will be decommissioned before their replacements are ready. However, this has less to do with funding and more to do with the availability of sailors. So, with that in mind, let's move on to the military's recruitment crisis. There are currently just under 140,000 members of the regular armed forces in the UK. This is split into around 32,000 members of the Royal Navy or the Royal Marines, 75,000 members of the Army, and around 31,000 members of the RAF. However, all those groups have seen a fall since 2022, with the fall across all groups totaling just under 6,000 people. The fall is also mainly down to voluntary outflow, which is the military term for anyone leaving the armed forces before the end of their engagement period or commission. So why are more people leaving the armed forces than signing up? Well, there have been a few reasons. First, in 2012, Capita was awarded the contract for army recruiting. Under Capita, there were reports that it takes months just to find a serving officer, let alone actually join the armed forces. Furthermore, getting people to want to join in the first place is proving difficult. Richard Mitchell, a former member of the Parachute Regiment, pointed out that part of the problem is that Iraq was exposed as a big lie and Afghanistan as a complete failure. Young people look at recent history and fear the same will happen again. This only gets worse when the conditions in the armed forces are considered. Last year, the military had to apologise for the fact that nearly a third of its housing needed repairs. There has also been a string of reported sexual harassment scandals in the media in recent years. These scandals involve the Red Arrows, submarine crews, and civilian staff at the Ministry of Defence. All these events likely contributed to a drop in morale, with surveys showing it really fell by a third. The government tried to address the recruitment crisis, with the Ministry of Defence raising pay by around 5%, plus $1,000 in the last year, the biggest increase for 20 years. However, if you think this is enough to solve any of the issues, then you are probably mistaken. The House of Commons Defence Committee said that unless the UK builds a prosperous industrial base and an offer that can attract and sustain enough personnel, the country will never achieve combat or strategic readiness. It is evident that the UK armed forces are going through a deep and multifaceted crisis. Chronic underinvestment allied to an obsession with the nuclear deterrent is corroding conventional capabilities, essential to project power and defend British interests on the global stage. Added to this, scandals and poor conditions deter young people from recruitment, threatening to undermine the very existence of the military forces in the future. In the face of this bleak picture, one has to wonder, is the proud United Kingdom becoming an obsolete and irrelevant military power? Leave your comment and join the debate.